The television lights burned white and merciless across Studio 7. 40 million Americans had tuned in that Tuesday evening, drawn by the promise of conflict dressed as conversation. The show was called America Speaks, though it was designed less for speaking than for spectacle. Tonight's topic: law and equality in modern America. Tonight's guests: a collision waiting to happen. Sarah Collins sat on the left side of the stage, spine straight as a flagpole, hands folded on the glass table. She wore her dress uniform, navy blue with silver insignia marking 15 years of service. Her hair was pulled back tight, revealing a face that had seen combat in Kandahar and riots in Baltimore, a face that trusted protocol more than promises. She had not wanted to come, but her captain had insisted, and Sarah Collins did not disobey orders. Across from her sat Judge Marcus Reed, 45 years old, the first black man to serve as Chief Justice of the Federal Circuit Court in his state's history. He wore a charcoal suit and burgundy tie, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the studio lights. His hands rested calmly on the table, his posture radiating the kind of patience that comes from a lifetime of explaining the obvious to people who refuse to see. The host, a woman with teeth too white and empathy too rehearsed, smiled into camera too and began her scripted introduction. She spoke of bridges. She spoke of dialogue. She spoke every word her producers had written to maximize tension, while pretending to minimize it. Then she asked the first question, and the bridges began to burn. Marcus Reed spoke about systemic bias, about young men who never made it home, about mothers who could not breathe for crying. He spoke in the measured cadence of courtrooms and classrooms, each word chosen for precision, each pause calculated for impact. He was not angry. He was exhausted. There is a difference. Sarah Collins listened with her jaw tight, and her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. When her turn came, she spoke about officers ambushed during traffic stops, about partners who bled out on sidewalks, while bystanders filmed instead of helping, about the weight of a badge that made you a target before you even drew your weapon. She spoke in the clipped rhythm of incident reports, stating facts, rejecting emotion. Back and forth they went, circling the same wound from opposite sides, each convinced the other refused to understand. Then Marcus said something about accountability, about how the system protected its own while claiming colorblindness, and Sarah Collins felt something crack inside her chest. She stood. The sudden movement startled the cameraman. Her chair scraped backward with a sound like a judge's gavel. She leaned forward, both palms flat on the glass table, and her voice cut through the studio like a blade through silk. Don't preach fairness when the law itself has color. The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. The host's smile fractured. The audience forgot to breathe. Marcus Reed sat utterly still, his expression unreadable except for his eyes, which had begun to shine with something that might have been tears, or might have been rage, or might have been both. Sarah remained standing for 3 full seconds, then sat down slowly, as if only now realizing what she had done. The host stammered something about taking a commercial break. The cameras cut away. But the damage was already done. In living rooms and bar stools and bedrooms across America, people began choosing sides before the echo had even faded. Within 9 minutes, the clip had been uploaded, downloaded, shared, screenshotted, captioned, weaponized. Within an hour, Sarah Collins was both a hero and a monster, depending on whose timeline you trusted. Nobody yet knew that in less than 3 days, both narratives would shatter. Nobody knew that the truth buried beneath this moment would split the country open in ways neither side had imagined. Nobody knew that Sarah Collins and Marcus Reed, enemies forged under studio lights, would become the most unlikely alliance in modern American justice. But that story begins not with their collision, but with their separate paths toward it. Sarah Collins had joined the police force at 22, fresh from a 4-year stint in the Army, where she had learned to take orders, keep formation, and trust the people beside her even when everything else proved untrustworthy. Her father had been military. His father before him. The Collins family did not ask questions about service. They showed up. They stood post. They did their duty. She had excelled in every training scenario, outshot men twice her size at the range, and earned commendations for valor during 2 separate domestic incidents where her calm under pressure saved civilian lives. Her superiors called her a model officer. Her subordinates called her tough but fair. The media called her Officer Sarah Collins, American hero, after she talked down an armed teenager outside a school in Northeast D.C., spending 40 minutes in the rain, convincing him that his life was worth living. She believed in the work. Believed in the badge. Believed that if you followed procedure and kept your hands clean and treated everyone with the same measure of respect, justice would follow. It had to. Otherwise, what was the point of the uniform? Marcus Reed had believed in justice too, once upon a time. He had grown up in Richmond, Virginia, the grandson of a man who had marched with King and the son of a woman who cleaned houses so he could go to college. He had graduated top of his class from Howard Law, spent a decade as a public defender representing clients who could not afford better, then worked his way up through the judiciary, with a reputation for fairness so unimpeachable that even his harshest critics could not deny his integrity. He had presided over drug cases and murder trials, civil disputes, and constitutional challenges. He had sentenced people to prison and set others free. He had read 10,000 case files and interviewed 1,000 witnesses, and through it all, he had seen the same pattern repeated so many times it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like design. The law was supposed to be blind. But Marcus Reed had learned, case by case, year by year, that blindness and willful ignorance are not the same thing. He took the judgeship to change things from the inside. He accepted speaking engagements to change minds from the outside. And when a major network called asking if he would debate a police officer on live television about racial bias in law enforcement, he said yes. Because he still believed, somewhere deep in his tired heart, that conversation could lead to transformation. He had not expected Sarah Collins. Had not expected her conviction, her certainty, her absolute unwillingness to see what seemed so obvious to him. And he certainly had not expected her to stand up in the middle of a live broadcast and accuse the law itself of racism while wearing the uniform meant to uphold it. The irony was almost too much to bear. The television network that hosted the debate was owned by a media conglomerate that donated heavily to political action committees on both sides of every issue. The show's producers had planned the confrontation with the precision of a military operation, booking guests they knew would clash, framing questions designed to provoke rather than enlighten, scheduling the broadcast for the week before midterm elections when tensions were already nuclear. They wanted fireworks. They got a 5-alarm blaze. By morning, Sarah Collins had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review. The police union issued a statement defending her right to free speech. Civil rights organizations demanded her termination. Politicians inserted themselves into the controversy with all the subtlety of vultures circling roadkill, each one claiming the moral high ground while standing on quicksand. Marcus Reed received death threats before breakfast. His office hired additional security. His wife begged him not to engage further. But Marcus had spent his entire career standing in courtrooms where people screamed at him, threatened him, questioned his competence and his motives, and his very right to sit behind the bench. He was not about to be silenced now. He scheduled a press conference for the following afternoon, and when the cameras assembled, he did not mince words. He spoke about a case from 10 years ago. A case that had haunted him ever since. A case involving a young black man named Terrence Walker, 23 years old, shot 7 times during a traffic stop in Southeast D.C. The official report stated that Terrence had reached for a weapon. The official report stated that officers feared for their lives. The official report was signed by the commanding officer on scene, Lieutenant Sarah Collins. The room erupted. Reporters shouted over each other. Marcus raised his hand for silence and continued. He explained that he had recently obtained evidence suggesting the official report was falsified, that Terrence Walker had been unarmed, that witnesses had been threatened into changing their statements, and that the whole case had been buried, to protect someone higher up the chain. He looked directly into the camera and said that Sarah Collins either knew the truth and participated in the cover-up, or she was too incompetent to see what was happening under her command. Either way, she had blood on her hands. The press conference was broadcast live. Sarah Collins watched it from her living room, standing 3 feet from the television screen, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. She remembered that night. Remembered it with the clarity of trauma, every detail sharp enough to cut. The traffic stop had gone bad in seconds. Terrence Walker had been pulled over for a broken taillight. 2 officers had approached. There had been shouting. Then gunfire. Then screaming. Then silence so loud it rang in your ears. Sarah had arrived minutes later as ranking officer on scene. She had followed protocol. Secured the scene. Interviewed the officers involved. Read their reports. Filed the paperwork. Everything by the book. Everything correct. Except it had not been correct. She knew that now. Had known it then, in the part of her brain that recognized wrongness the way a body recognizes poison. But she had trusted the system. Trusted her fellow officers. Trusted that if something was deeply wrong, someone above her pay grade would catch it. Nobody had caught it. Or someone had caught it, and buried it deeper. Marcus Reed had just accused her on national television of being complicit in murder. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach twist and her vision blur, was that she could not prove him wrong. The hate mail started that evening. The threats came the next morning. Someone spray-painted her apartment door, Someone else slashed her tires. The union told her to stay quiet and let their lawyers handle everything. Her captain told her she was a liability. Her friends stopped answering her calls. Sarah Collins, who had spent 15 years believing in the system, watched that system abandon her in 48 hours. She could have quit. Could have disappeared. Could have accepted the narrative being written about her and faded into whatever obscurity former heroes occupy when their stories curdle. Instead, she started digging. She began with the Terrence Walker file, requesting copies through 3 different channels, finding excuses when the first 2 denied her access. She cross-referenced incident reports with shift schedules. She tracked down witnesses who had moved away or changed their names. She called in favors from people who still believed in her, or at least believed in old debts being honored. The work was slow and dangerous and illegal in ways that would have gotten her arrested if anyone noticed. But Sarah Collins had spent 4 years in the Army learning how to operate behind enemy lines. She knew how to move quietly. On the 5th day of her suspension, she drove to Baltimore to meet Eddie Brooks. Eddie had served with her in Afghanistan, a medic from Chicago who had saved her life twice, once from enemy fire, and once from herself, when she had wanted to give up, after watching 3 civilians die in a bombing she could not prevent. He had left the service a year before she did, became a paramedic, then a firefighter, then a community organizer in Baltimore's roughest neighborhoods. She found him in a rec center that smelled like floor polish and old basketballs, running an after-school program for kids who needed somewhere safe to exist for a few hours. He saw her walk in, and his face went through 3 emotions in 2 seconds. Surprise, concern, recognition. They sat in his office while teenagers played basketball on the court outside. The sound of sneakers squeaking and voices laughing filtering through the thin walls. "You look like hell," Eddie said. "I feel worse," Sarah replied. She told him everything. About the broadcast, about Marcus Reed's accusations, about the Terrence Walker case that would not stop bleeding. Eddie listened without interrupting, his dark eyes steady, his hands folded on the desk between them. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of decisions made and roads not taken. "I was there that night," he said. Sarah's heart stopped. "What?" "Not on scene. But I was 2 blocks away, working a fire response. We heard the shots. By the time we got there, your people had the whole area locked down. We were told to leave. Told it was under control." He leaned forward. "But before we left, I saw something. Saw one of the senior officers talking to someone in a black sedan. Civilian vehicle. They were arguing. Then the civilian handed him something. An envelope. Thick enough to be cash or documents." Sarah felt cold, spreading through her chest. "Who was the officer?" "Deputy Chief Thomas Warren." The name landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward, disturbing everything. Thomas Warren. Decorated veteran. 30-year career. Now retired with full honors. Living in a house in Annapolis that cost 3 times what his pension should have allowed. Sarah had served under him, trusted him, looked up to him. "Why didn't you report it?" she asked. Though she already knew the answer. "Report it to who?" Eddie's voice was tired. "Warren was connected. Still is. I was a black medic who nobody would believe over a deputy chief. And honestly, Sarah, I had my own problems back then. I was just trying to survive." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a flash drive. "But I kept notes. Everything I saw that night. Dates, times, license plate number of that sedan. I never knew what to do with it. Figured it would just get me killed if I tried to use it. But if you're going in, you might as well go armed." Sarah took the flash drive. It felt like a grenade. "Warren will destroy you if he finds out you're looking into this," Eddie warned. "He has friends everywhere. In the department. In the mayor's office. Hell, probably in the FBI. He already destroyed me," Sarah said quietly. "I'm just trying to figure out why." She spent the next 3 days chasing ghosts. The license plate Eddie had written down belonged to a shell company that no longer existed. The witnesses from the original case had scattered across 3 states. The physical evidence from the scene had been lost in a warehouse fire 2 years after the incident. But Sarah had learned patience in the Army and persistence in the police academy. She kept digging. And slowly, carefully, she began to find threads that connected back to Thomas Warren, and through him, to a network of officers, lawyers, and politicians who had spent decades protecting each other, while claiming to protect the public. The Terrence Walker case was not unique. It was a pattern. One incident among dozens, maybe hundreds, where inconvenient truths were buried, witnesses silenced, reports falsified. Not because individual officers were monsters, but because the system itself had learned to survive by eating its own mistakes. Sarah had been a mistake. A young lieutenant who followed orders and trusted her superiors, and never questioned whether the truth she was recording was actually true. She had been used, made complicit, turned into a shield for people who needed someone clean to take the fall if the walls ever came down. Now the walls were coming down. And Sarah Collins intended to be holding the match when they started burning, but she could not do it alone. She needed someone with credibility, with access, with a platform that could not be silenced by backroom deals and threatened pensions. She needed someone the public would believe, even if it meant working with someone who hated her. She needed Marcus Reed. Finding him was the easy part. Getting him to listen was harder. His office refused her calls. His security team turned her away at the courthouse. His wife answered the door at his home and told Sarah, in terms both polite and absolute, that she was not welcome there. Sarah finally caught him leaving his church on Sunday morning, stepping out of the 10 o'clock service into autumn sunlight that made the stained glass behind him glow like prophecy. She had been waiting in her car for 90 minutes. She intercepted him in the parking lot before his security detail could react. 2 minutes, she said. That's all I'm asking. Marcus Reed looked at her with an expression carved from stone. You have nothing I want to hear. Thomas Warren, Sarah said. Deputy Chief, retired. He's the one who falsified the Terrence Walker report. He's the one who's been covering up police brutality cases for 20 years. And he set me up to take the fall if anyone ever started asking questions. Marcus stopped walking. His security guard moved to intervene, but Marcus raised a hand. Go on. I have evidence, Sarah continued. Not enough to convict. Not yet. But enough to start an investigation that he can't stop. Enough to reopen cases that were closed. Enough to change things. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket. I can't do this alone. Nobody will believe me. I'm already guilty in the public eye. But if you help me, if we do this together, maybe we can actually fix what's broken instead of just screaming at each other about who's more broken. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the flash drive in her hand. Then back at her face. You're asking me to trust you, he said. After everything, I'm asking you to trust the evidence, Sarah replied. Trust it or don't. But if you want justice for Terrence Walker, if you want accountability for every case like his, this is how it happens. Not with debates and press conferences. With proof. Marcus was quiet. The church bells behind them began to ring noon. Finally, he held out his hand. Sarah placed the flash drive in his palm. One chance, he said. You lie to me, you waste my time, you put my reputation on the line for anything less than the truth, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Deal, Sarah said. They met in secret over the next week, usually late at night in places where nobody would recognize them. An empty diner in Tacoma Park. A closed library in Silver Spring. Once, memorably, in the basement of an abandoned church where rain leaked through the ceiling and puddled on the stone floor. Marcus brought legal expertise and access to sealed court records. Sarah brought investigative instincts and knowledge of how police departments actually operated beneath the official protocols. Together, they began building a case that connected Thomas Warren to a network of corruption so vast and so entrenched that it made both of them question whether any justice system could survive this kind of rot. They found evidence of falsified reports in over 40 cases. They found witnesses who had been paid to lie, and others who had been threatened into silence. They found a pattern of promotions and transfers that protected dirty cops while punishing clean ones. They found bank accounts and property records that proved Warren and his associates had been profiting from the very system they claimed to serve. And they found something else. Something neither of them had expected. They found each other. Not romantically. Nothing so simple or so neat. But they found a mutual respect that cut through the assumptions they had carried onto that television stage. Sarah learned that Marcus was not some ivory tower idealist disconnected from reality. He had spent decades in the trenches of the justice system, making hard calls, living with consequences, knowing that every decision left someone unhappy, and many left someone hurt. He was not naive. He was exhausted. And he kept fighting anyway. Marcus learned that Sarah was not some blindly obedient cog in a corrupt machine. She was a soldier who had believed in the mission, who had trusted the people beside her, who had been betrayed by the very institution she had sworn to serve. She was not heartless. She was wounded, and she kept fighting anyway. One night, sitting in Sarah's apartment surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups, Marcus said something that would stay with both of them. The law can't heal, unless the truth bleeds first. Sarah nodded. Then let's make it bleed. They called the network together. the same network that had hosted their disastrous debate 3 weeks earlier. The producers, smelling ratings gold, agreed immediately to a second broadcast. This time, the guests would appear not as opponents, but as allies. The show was scheduled for a Friday evening. Prime time. Maximum audience. Sarah and Marcus spent the 2 days before the broadcast preparing, rehearsing, anticipating every question and objection. They knew they would only get one shot at this. The corruption they were exposing had survived for decades by discrediting its enemies before evidence could surface. They needed to be perfect. The night of the broadcast, Sarah put on her dress uniform again, though this time it felt less like armor and more like a shroud. Marcus wore the same suit he had worn 3 weeks earlier, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the studio lights in the same way. But when they sat down at that glass table, everything was different. The host began with the obvious question. 3 weeks ago, you two had what many called the most explosive confrontation in live television history. Tonight, you're sitting together. What changed? Marcus spoke first. We found the truth. Then Sarah continued. And the truth was uglier than either of us wanted to admit. For the next 40 minutes, they laid it all out. Sarah described the Terrence Walker case in detail, explaining how she had been manipulated into signing off on a false report, how she had trusted her superiors and been used by them. Marcus presented the evidence they had compiled, explaining how the corruption extended far beyond one case. How it had infected the entire system. They showed documents. They named names. They connected dots that viewers could verify themselves. Thomas Warren's name appeared on screen 17 times. Each time, a new piece of evidence. Each time, another lie exposed. The studio was silent except for their voices. The host, for once, had nothing to add. This was not a debate anymore. It was a confession and an accusation, a reckoning delivered in stereo. When they finished, Sarah looked directly into the camera and said, I wore this uniform because I believed in what it represented. I'm still wearing it because I believe we can make it mean something again. But that starts with telling the truth, even when the truth destroys us. Marcus added, America didn't change because we argued. It changed because we listened. The broadcast ended. The backlash was immediate and enormous. Thomas Warren denied everything. His lawyers threatened lawsuits. His political allies circled the wagons. The police union called the allegations baseless. But the evidence was public now. Stored on servers, downloaded by millions, impossible to delete or suppress. Independent journalists began investigating. Federal prosecutors opened inquiries. Internal affairs departments in 4 different jurisdictions launched reviews. 3 months later, Thomas Warren was indicted on 37 counts, including falsifying reports, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights. 17 other officers were charged in related cases. The scandal reached high enough that 2 mayors resigned and a senator declined to run for re-election. Sarah Collins was cleared of all wrongdoing and reinstated with back pay. She declined. Instead, she left the police force and joined a nonprofit organization dedicated to reforming law enforcement training and accountability procedures. She spent her days teaching young officers how to recognize corruption before it consumed them. Marcus Reed was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a ceremony at the White House. He accepted it on behalf of all the people who had been failed by the system he had spent his life trying to fix. He continued serving as a judge, but now he was working with legislators to change the laws that had allowed such corruption to flourish. They appeared together at the National Memorial Service for Victims of Police Violence, standing side by side as the names were read aloud. Terrence Walker. And so many others. A litany of loss that seemed endless. When it was their turn to speak, Marcus went first. He talked about accountability and redemption, about systems built by humans and therefore capable of being rebuilt. He talked about hope, though his voice broke when he said the word. Then Sarah stepped to the microphone. She wore civilian clothes now, a simple black dress. No uniform. No badge. Just a woman trying to make peace with her past. I thought the law was supposed to be blind, she said. But blindness isn't justice. It's just another way of not seeing. Real justice requires us to look directly at what's broken, even when it reflects our own faces back at us. She paused. The crowd was silent. The cameras were rolling. I can't undo what happened under my watch, she continued. I can't bring back the people we failed. But I can make sure their names aren't forgotten. I can make sure the system that killed them doesn't kill anyone else. And I can stand here, next to Judge Reed, and tell you that change is possible when we stop seeing enemies and start seeing each other. The service ended with a moment of silence. 5 minutes, where 40,000 people stood together without speaking, without moving, just existing in shared acknowledgement of pain and possibility. In the months that followed, reforms began spreading across the country. Body camera policies were strengthened. Independent oversight boards were established. Training programs were redesigned. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. A beginning. Sarah and Marcus stayed in touch. Not close friends, but something deeper than that. Allies who had walked through fire together and emerged changed. They spoke at conferences together. They consulted on policy reforms together. They reminded each other, on the hard days, why they were still fighting. One afternoon, nearly a year after that second broadcast, they met for coffee in a small cafe in Northwest D. Sea rain streaked the windows. The place was mostly empty. "Do you think we actually changed anything?" Sarah asked. Marcus thought about it. "I think we proved that change is possible. Whether it lasts depends on people who weren't in that studio with us." "That's not very reassuring." "No," Marcus agreed, "but it's true." Sarah smiled, tired but genuine. "I'll take truth over reassurance any day." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had learned the hard way that justice was not a destination but a direction, not a declaration but a daily choice. They had been enemies for 8 minutes on live television. That clip would probably outlive them both, endlessly replayed, endlessly reinterpreted. But for those who looked past the soundbite, who followed the story to its conclusion, there was another image to remember. Sarah Collins and Marcus Reed, standing together at a memorial service, their faces grave but determined, representing the possibility that even in a country divided against itself, even in a system built on compromises and contradictions, people could still choose to do the harder right over the easier wrong. The law had color. They both knew that now. But they also knew that color was not destiny. That corruption was not inevitable. That the system could be forced to see what it had spent decades trying to ignore. America did not change that night. Sarah Collins stood up at a glass table and said something unforgivable. America changed in the weeks and months afterward. When she and Marcus Reed chose to listen instead of shout, to investigate instead of accuse, to build bridges instead of burning them. The work continues. The fight goes on. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., a former police officer and a federal judge are still reminding each other why it matters. Because the law itself may have color. But justice, real justice, the kind worth fighting for, is written in every shade.